Okay, the final episode of the first season of X-Men 97 came out this week, and I thought I'd share some thoughts on it. I've always really liked the X-Men. I think they're my favorite superhero team. I like the Justice League and I like the Avengers, but to me, a lot of those characters are often better portrayed individually, whereas the X-Men are very team-oriented characters, very family-oriented characters. And they're weird. X-Men stories are some of the weirdest shit in comics. It's kind of like a soap opera with mutant powers a lot of the time. It's pretty great. And it's probably the most allegorical comic book property. It hits you over the head with the allegory. It can be very similar to Star Trek in that way, which is probably one of the reasons why I like it. And no matter who you are, I think you can probably relate to the X-Men on some level. And as a whole, I was really impressed with this show. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I want to try to avoid spoilers if you haven't checked it out yet. But I may reference a few things without going into too much plot detail. It was really interesting to see the first few episodes of this show because it immediately takes you back to the 90s show. Episodes 1 through 4 are really just a continuation of that. It's a little bit more adult, which is smart. The show is aware that the target audience is older now. And as much as everyone loves the old show, I think most people want to see something a little bit more adult, which is great. But I don't think anyone was ready for it to be this adult. Because when you finally get to episode 5, it's like they're saying, it's time to grow up. It's not the 90s anymore, and you're not a kid. This is what it would really be like. And it quickly becomes less like the 90s show and more like the comics. Not to say the 90s show wasn't faithful to the comics, it was. But it just had kind of that Saturday morning kid-friendly aspect to it. And the show takes into account that it's been nearly 30 years since that show ended. Like, I remember reading the Fatal Attraction storyline when it first came out. And even as a kid, I thought, they'll never do anything like this on the show. The comics at the time were a little bit more violent, more adult. Professor Xavier has like a stubble on his face, like he hasn't shaved in a couple of days. There was a sharp contrast between the 90s show and the 90s comics. But not anymore. I really feel like they were doing stories from the comics closer to how they were in the comics. Although they are very condensed versions of those stories. I mean, they're flying through issues. It's actually hard to keep track. It's like 1 minute they're doing kind of Goblin Queen, Cable, Mr. Sinister stuff, and the next minute they're doing stuff from Fatal Attractions, for instance. But overall, it's fantastic. The animation is great. The voice acting is great. It's a mixture of returning actors from the 90s series and new actors. And I think they all did a great job. And everyone gets their due for the most part. I thought Morph was a great addition, although he is kind of used sometimes as just a character to create cameos of other characters that like you wouldn't normally see in the X-Men. But that's fine. And it was also great to see Nightcrawler become kind of a regular member of the team. If I'm not mistaken, I think he only appears in one episode of the original show, which is a shame because he was already a staple in the X-Men comics and had been for years. And he only got more popular in the 90s, but the original show kind of ignored him outside of that one episode. It was a great episode, but it would have been nice if he could have been in the show more. And I also kind of wish Psylocke could have appeared. She's another popular 90s X-Men character that only briefly appears in the original show. And she has only a little cameo in X-Men 97. So it would be cool if they could do something with Psylocke at some point. And if I had one complaint, it's a minor complaint, and I fully understand why they did it. But it does kind of feel like Wolverine has really taken a back seat in X-Men 97. He doesn't have a lot to do in this season. There are things that involve him, big things, but for the most part, he's very much a secondary member of the team. And I get it, because Wolverine, for the last 30 years or so, has taken the spotlight from other X-Men characters, both in the comics and in everything else. The X-Men movies were pretty much Wolverine movies. You could make the argument that the only X-Men movies that aren't Wolverine movies are First Class, Apocalypse, and Dark Phoenix, I think. Does he appear in Dark Phoenix? I don't even know. That movie is... Ugh, ugh. But even if he's not in Dark Phoenix, he's still in 2 out of the 3 movies I just mentioned. So it makes sense to put Wolverine on the back burner for a while, just to let some of the other characters shine a little bit more. But as a Wolverine fan, it's a little disappointing. Although I have to imagine that based on some of the stuff that happened with Wolverine in this season, next season we'll have some good Wolverine stuff. You know, just as long as he doesn't lose his nose. That was a dark time. And the characters that the show does focus on are, I would say, Cyclops, Jean, Magneto, and Rogue. I would say those are the 4 main characters. And maybe to a lesser degree, Storm, because she does kind of have a whole episode all to herself. And they're all great. I have no complaints about what they did with any of those characters. It was phenomenal stuff, especially Magneto. It really showcases that he is the most complex villain, maybe of all time. I mean, when Magneto is done well, it shows that he is both right and wrong at the same time, because he is right. What he says is right, but what he does is often wrong. He's killed thousands of people, some of which were innocent. He's also killed mutants, which kind of makes him a bit of a hypocrite. But the good and the bad are what makes him such an interesting character. And this show might just be the best portrayal of Magneto outside of the comics. No disrespect to Ian McKellen in the movies. He was great. But I think this is the version of Magneto that I think of when I think of Magneto. And there's also a ton of cameos from other Marvel characters. If you could think of a Marvel character that is not affiliated with the X-Men, they probably appear at some point in the show. I mean, most of the time it was a brief cameo, and that's actually something that I would normally have a problem with, but it didn't bother me here because all they did with them is show that this is like a national thing. It's a global thing, really. So it's affecting everyone. So when they show other Marvel heroes, they're just kind of helping out in their own way, which they would. There is, however, one cameo that kind of bothered me, and it was the biggest one. And this is a minor spoiler, so I'll let you know when you should skip to if you want to avoid it. Okay. Ready? Captain America appears in the show. And unlike the other cameos, he actually has a fair amount of dialogue. He's speaking with Rogue, and I just didn't really like how he was portrayed. I never like it when Captain America is portrayed as this kind of sort of towing the party line kind of guy. You know, the kind of guy that cares more about how things look rather than how things are and how they should be. And some of his dialogue indicates that he's that kind of person. He's not outright wrong, because Rogue is kind of flying off the handle herself. But it kind of annoyed me that he was portrayed like that. I mean, Civil War, the storyline of Civil War, if it did anything, it showed that Captain America is not worried about how others perceive him. He's just not worried about that kind of judgment. And in the show, he's kind of wishy-washy with Rogue. You know, it's like, I want to help, but my hands are tied, that kind of thing. So that kind of annoyed me. But other than that, I'm kind of struggling to find anything to complain about with this show. Actually, I do have one complaint. Sometimes this show forgets that it's the 90s. There's one scene involving a character, and I can't say who it is because it's a spoiler, but a character says something like, "I appreciate you speaking the quiet part out loud." And it's like, come on. Nobody said that shit in the 90s. Especially not a character that is like in his 50s or 60s. The quiet part out loud is something that, you know, younger people have said on the internet for like the last 5 years. So I do admit that line really took me out of it briefly. And there's also some other corniness. Like there's a surprising amount of dancing in the show. And it's usually not to music that was popular in 1997, which is maybe a good thing. I mean, do we really need to see Jubilee and Sunspot doing the Macarena or jamming out to Mbop, you know. So maybe it's good that they spared us something like that. But you could tell I'm really struggling to find things to complain about if this trivial shit is what I'm coming up with. So needless to say, the show was fantastic. It's very much in line with the 90s show, but at the same time, it's all new, all different. Huh? See what I did there? It's uncanny. I could do this all day, but I won't because I'm not a complete psychopath. So, if I were to give it some dick rocks, you could probably guess, I give it 5 dick rocks out of 5. Check it out. Even if you're a casual X-Men fan, I think you'll appreciate it. And I know a lot of people had doubts about this show because it's Disney. And really, since Avengers Endgame, they have been absolutely directionless. The live-action stuff has no idea what it's doing right now. And it hasn't all been bad, but I would say very little of it has been great. So it's not surprising that people thought this would be just another directionless mess, but thankfully, it's not. It's great. But that's about all I got for now. If you've seen the show, let me know what you think of it, and let me know how you feel about the X-Men in general. And I'm going to be doing some summertime videos. You know, I like to do those. I've got a couple of movie commentary ideas for movies that are very summer-oriented. You know, some 80s and 90s action sci-fi movies that really remind you of summer, or at least remind me of summer. So hopefully those will turn out good. I'm also going to be doing a video for Star Trek Insurrection at some point, but that might take me a little bit. You know I like to be thorough when it comes to Star Trek, especially with the ones where there's a lot to complain about, and I think Insurrection is one of those movies. But anyway, that's all I got for now. Thanks for listening to me yap about the X-Men, and until next time, take it easy.